Hey there, it's just Troy Yamaguchi for Plus Two, and today I have a follow-up to the last video that I made on this channel, which was about the concept of post-rotation SWU as like new SWU, like a very fundamentally different game than pre-rotation SWU. And in that video, I went over all of the changes that were imposed from like a design perspective, starting as early as Twilight, the third set. So since that video, there's been yet another card pool released, and this is especially important as we're preparing for the Galactic Championship, which will be run underneath this set. So I want to talk a little bit about the updates to my understanding to this framework since Ashes of Empire, and so I've titled this video like New SWU. I have a lot of opinions about what the game is asking us for right now, and that's what we're going to get into today. So, as usual, my main content is now currently being homed under Eclipse TCG. This is the more like brass tacks stuff. As for what I think constitutes the metagame, what makes a good deck, what makes a bad deck, like what should you play next week, the good cards in your deck. Like these are the discussions that occur on that channel. This is like more home for the theoretical discussions and the abstract dirtlings on what makes Star Wars Unlimited the game that it is. And to me, at least, I think that these questions are instrumental to having a good understanding of the format and being able to pick a good deck. It talks a lot about the questions that are being asked of you from a format. And so I wanted to use this Plus Two channel, which is my own personal channel, to have some of these like more abstract conversations that are not just the like quote unquote like useful things of what should I play, what is being played at the moment, and just tell me what a good deck is. This is kind of the framework that I use to just think about the game. I spend a lot of time thinking about Star Wars Unlimited. It's a fun game. It's fun to think about the game as well, but from a competitor's mindset, I do think that these theoretical concepts are important to figuring out where to situate yourself within a metagame. Speaking of, if you like listening to me talk about SWU for whatever reason, um, I have been invited to the compete panel at the Galactic Championship, so that means that I am officially a credible SWU pundit, which means that everything I say is correct. But the secret is everything I say is always correct because it's my channel and I said so. Anyway, so I'll be at this panel at 1 p.m. on Friday. If you're at the GC and you have time to visit this panel, I encourage you to do so. Obviously, it'll be great. I'll be joined by a number of the Star Wars Unlimited competitors and content creators that you may know, and I'm sure it'll be a great time. So I wanted to promote that real quick before we got started. Okay. Last time on Plus Two, I talked about this recalibrations article in a good amount of depth. I thought that this article really like showed you the mindset that the designers were taking, and a lot of these like issues that they identified in this article came to fruition within A Lawless Time, or like the adjustments that they were trying to make. Like A Lawless Time very, very clearly reflects intentionally the design decisions that they wanted according to this article. So I don't quite have the keys to the kingdom for this talk. I haven't like kept up 100% on these dev articles since, but like this one in particular just like was very, very like illuminating, and kind of speaks to what we're playing, like the environment that we're playing in today. So updates to this, I talked about like what I expected set 7 to look like, or like what the format was at the beginning of A Lawless Time. And of course, like that format has now concluded, so I have like a further perspective on like what ended up happening. So in the like new SWU video, I talked about the difference between old SWU, which like was this board apocalypse environment where you can never stick a unit, like things were always dying, and you just like had to end up like +1 guy on your opponent, as opposed to new SWU, which was this kind of like mid-range paradise for cows, where like you're really just like ignoring each other and racing a lot of the times. Like that's what a lot of the good decks ended up being. If you have additional time, like I would really encourage you to watch that video. I don't know, I'm pretty proud of like how it turned out eventually, and I think it was I don't want to say it's prophetic, like that sounds stupid, but like I don't know, I think it like well summed up the Lawless Time ecosystem. Anyway, what ended up happening in A Lawless Time is we had this like ignoring each other, like hitting base and racing type of Star Wars Unlimited environment. That was the format going into Atlanta, and like everyone was complaining about it, like, oh, aggressive negotiation is so broken, like, oh, it's brainless, you just hit people, like um yeah. And the deck that like kind of like threw a wrench into this metagame was the Lando Lake Country deck that my team invented. So of course I have to glaze this deck crazy. I mean, this deck was broken. not only was it like a very good racing deck just because Faith in Your Friends outputs so much stats, but like the Codebreaker package and just like having access to efficient removal in the terms of in the form of like Axe, Beguile, and like especially Blue Ace was like really well positioned at that Atlanta event. All of these tools just made Lando Lake Country like especially well suited to the environment of New SWU, because like number one, you were racing, you were an aggressive negotiations deck, you were like a better aggressive negotiations deck than a lot because your draw engine created like damage, which was kind of crazy. So like not only were you a great racing deck, but you had just like the only effective interaction tools in the format, in a format where people were playing one card per turn. So Lando Lake Country was kind of like the breakout deck at Atlanta, and like went on to continue to define the format. I mean, even at the conclusion, I was very much of the mind that this was like the best deck to be playing bar none. But kind of towards the end of the format, another good deck hit the towers, and this was Deidre Miro, and like very similar as well in that like this was a deck packing a lot of removal. So like you were interrupting this like mid-range paradise for cows. You were saying like, I'm not going to play your game. I'm not going to like just try to trade hits with you and like close my eyes and see who wins. I'm going to manage your board and then eventually end up sticking Devastator into Planet Bomb. That was this entire deck. It was a Devastator Planet Bomb deck. Yes, it looked like a control deck. Yes, it was correct probably to call this deck control. But like if you really, really, really wanted to split hairs, I mean, the Dev PB strategy was like the deck's core identity, right? Like SRI, Dev PB, like that was the deck's winning pattern. And so it won through combat, it won through units, and like it won just because most decks did not have an answer to Devastator. So when a Devastator readied, like you kind of just won the game for free. And that was this deck's like entire thesis. So set 7 started with mid-range Paradise for Cal, and kind of like ended up in this world where the decks that I thought were really good at the end of the set did have interaction. Like they were exploiting the environment that they were made to be a part of. Like Boba Fett was up here as well, like in the top 3 deck, but I didn't include them in graphic because it doesn't support my point, and the Fetts are criminals, so I've excluded them from my slideshow. But in general, like I thought Deidre and Lando were both very good decks, and it was just interesting to see how, you know, you establish a context for what defines a good deck at the start of the form. You find all like the good level 1 plays, and then the decks that end up being like most dominant once all the information are out there are subverting the like fundamental goals of the format, which were just like hit base, you know, base HP matters. But like base HP continued to matter because like Lando played a 34 HP and Teacher played a 35 HP base. So like even within these strategies, there was concessions to the fact that like in a lawless time, your ability to manage the board was very limited. And so your base was like always under threat, and you know, you could die pretty easily in this format. So anyway, that's the kind of wrap up on like New SWU, where we ended up at the end of set 7. So let's talk today about where set 8 is going like from this, and what like the new environment is. I already talked about all of this thing. Racing was important, base HP was important. I've gone about that, you know, over and over. And I made an entire, the last video was an entire hour of just like trying to beat that point kind of home. This is pretty important as well to that video, where most decks are presenting lethal on like very specific turns. This is like a core concept of New SWU, which is this like, instead in old SWU it was like, I don't know when the game's gonna end when I build my deck. I don't say like I'm gonna, you know, kill them on 7R, 8R, even, you know, whatever. It's just like I'm just gonna put good cards in my deck, and like I'm gonna slop back and forth with them. We might end the game on 11 resources, we might end the game on 12 resources. It depends on, you know, how well things go early, how well my opponent continues to draw in the grind game. You know, old SWU games like lasted forever, and it was very like unclear when the game was going to end. You could, I don't know, I've had Han 1 yellow games, like that's a tempo deck, that's an aggressive deck. I've had games go to like, you know, 14, 15 resources, like it's ridiculous. Anyway, final like important point and like metagame consideration of set 7 was that the tall inevitability decks were like almost completely missing from the format, and even the ones that did exist like Deidre, Lando Blue, and Piet, these 3 strategies like conformed to the above strategy. Like Lando Blue was like a deck that was a taller idea, and it was like an inevitability deck because you have like Bo-Katan in your, you have a 9-drop in your deck, but like you're playing on 6, and like the game is slated to end after Bo-Katan touches them twice, and like if Liberty touches them twice, you know, things like that. So you weren't just saying like I'm just gonna play the game forever and ever. It's like no, I'm very much trying to end the game. Like even Deidre, a control deck, right? You're saying I go SRI Dev PB, that's how I win. You know, I want to end the game with that pattern like almost every time. I don't want to just like directionlessly slog through and try to mill them out or anything like that. It was always ending the game through combat. So interesting set. I really actually enjoyed set 7 quite a bit. One of my favorite formats for this game. This is not what I was expecting with, rotation. It's always really scary. Like, you took away all my good cards, you took away all my good leaders. Like, I don't know what's going to happen, but the game ended up being pretty fantastic. I would say one of the most interesting formats to be a part of. Only like kind of rivaled by GC just because GC mattered so much, and like the post force ban metagame was also pretty interesting. So between these, like set 7 was a great format, and I don't know, it just makes me interested for what's going to happen at this GC. Okay, speaking of which, on the main channel, I am always trying to figure out, what is the move for the Galactic Championship. That's what the content has been about for the last month or so. And again, I just want to reiterate that like all this theory discussion and the whole reason I'm trying to understand what makes the set 8 environment different from the set 7 environment, different from the set 1 through 3 environment. The whole reason to have these like abstract discussions is because I think it improves your ability to make good choices going into a competitive event. Like I said, I enjoy thinking about the game. I enjoy, just as like a general gamer, like I enjoy just like understanding what's happening in the game. But like as a competitor, like I do think that these things have like actual tangible effects. I wanted to hit you with like a mid-roll ad here. A couple of people have asked me if I do one-on-one consultations, and I figured I would throw out the idea out there for anybody interested. I have a conception of a like series of sessions for GC prep in particular. These would be 45-minute one-on-one discussions. I would also put about an hour of research into whatever questions that you had in terms of your preparations. I think that, I have a lot of time to think about Star Wars Unlimited and not a lot of money. And I understand that some people have the opposite problem where they have money and not a lot of time to think of Star Wars Unlimited. So if you would like somebody that thinks about this game quite a bit to kind of feed you information about the format, help you streamline your testing and everything like that, that's a service that I would like to provide. So the form's in the description. Don't want to belabor this point too much, but if it's of interest to anybody, I figured throw it out there. Why not? Happy to share what I understand about this format, what I understand about the decks and their given matchups to help make your testing more efficient and kind of like lead you down the right path, or kind of like help you come to your own conclusions, whatever kind of cliched line like that. So that's this. I wanted to put this out there. Forms in the description. Please check it out. Okay, let's get into the meat and potatoes of the discussion. Set 8 changes. So we are in this kind of like interesting environment of a mixture between like old and new SWU. There's like almost like a ideological contrast between a lot of decks in terms of how they're trying to play. And this, of course, is a result of the card pool. Everyone has all access to the same card pool, and anyone can bring any strategy at a time. And whatever is popular is just like what the prevailing thought at the moment is. A lot of this is currently being defined by the powerful like blue, like almost all the good cards in the new set are blue. Crispy like made an entire video on this. A lot of the new powerful like on-play cards are very reminiscent of old SWU. If you think of someone like CHIMERA and pre-VIZLA, like these are ridiculous cards. The power level of cards and leaders and subsequently decks post-rotation are quite a bit lower than what they were pre-rotation. And you can just see this from, what's going on in the internal meta, where like all the eternal leaders are pre-rotation, of course, and like good number of the cards are pre-rotation as well, and like very few like post-rotation things are quite standing up to muster. But like CHIMERA and pre-VIZLA are cards that, had they existed pre-rotation, like these are still like busted cards. These cards are ridiculous. They're very active. They're doing something incredibly imposing, and like if they stick around, you will win the game. So this is these cards being printed are pretty reminiscent of old SWU, and it's what's informing a lot of people's current approach to the metagame. But something that's pretty interesting is the cost of leaders. And I mentioned this in last, the like other new SWU video. The cost of leaders is still like high. Like they didn't go back and print a lot of good like 5-cost leaders like they would in old SWU. If you look at the leaders printed in Ashes, like all the good ones are like, once again, 6-cost leaders. So that's pretty important as well. And I'll talk about a little bit more of the implications of that in a bit. So more similar to new SWU there. And I talked about how like tall inevitability decks were like pretty absent from the format outside of some notable exceptions. It was like Deidre, I would consider that, and like Piet was, but like that was a fringe deck. Outside of that, like everything else was like mostly aggressive laning and like kind of some like even like mid range was not really accounted for. Like Leia Data Vault was like a beatdown deck, and it tried to kill you on the same turn every time. And like even Lando Lake was like kind of a mid range deck, but like once again, like you're trying to just beat your opponent down and pretty much kill them on 6, 7, 8 every single time. Like you weren't playing a ton of like board combat. Anyway, that's like quite no longer the case. The tall inevitability decks are like the current gestalt, not gestalt, but like they're the prevailing like strategy at this time, right? And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, okay, these decks weren't popular in the previous format. They're back now. Is that just because people are trying to go back and play old school, or is this like once like kind of actually reverting, and is this new environment actually calling for these things? So you have this contrast of old and new SWU ideas, and of course these will all shake out at the GC. So here's where like kind of everything is divided right now. Set 8 is pretty interesting, right? A lot of the new decks are good. So like Cad Bane, Mandalorian, and Krennic, these are all like trying to do the board control idea and like trying to play this like tall mid-range concept in the style of old SWU, more or less. Like Cad Bane most of all. Mandalorian's like a weird control deck. These decks have like continued to exist, and even like Deidre like is reminiscent of this deck. And then Krennic is like just like another like pre-VIZLA Chimera shell, doing something pretty similar to Cad Bane, and trying to play like an old SWU, ramp, play big things, type of idea. You could easily see, it's trying to like recapture blue-green villains' glory days, but, and I talked about on the Eclipse channel how I think that's a little bit of a mistake. So you have like all of these decks set to one side where, Cad especially is trying to remove your board every single turn, be really active, hit your units with its units, and like end up +1 guy. Very, very old SWU type of gameplay. Then again, you have the new SWU idea of just like, I'm going to build a beatdown deck and hit your face. Boba Fett Lake Country is like pretty much unchanged from the previous format and like continues to be a good deck. More or less the same with Leia. Ahsoka is just another like Leia-like blue-green hero concept. These are decks that are trying to output aggression and, just run the clock on base and end the game. So these strategies are very much into conflict, and it's interesting to me that we have these like different approaches to the format and some of the difficulties that each one face. Almost as like a pejorative, I think that these two sides of the coin can be boiled down, because if we're comparing things to old SWU, again, I just have to reemphasize, like, the decks now are much, much worse than they were in the past. The color, you putting even something as simple as putting single reactor ignition in a 3-color pair so that it's not just accessible to all of the blue villain decks, like, that changes your card pool. This kind of like makes blue-green villain a much different deck than the blue-green villain in the past. So, more so than like this like totally control your whole board idea, I actually want to start thinking about these like taller mid-range decks as like the I'm gonna do nothing type of strategies. This is especially true of Krennic and Mandalorian, which are decks that are like going down on board quite a bit and then like trying to make the big turnaround, turn the corner type of move. Krennic with its like powerful on play guys, and then the Mandalorian just like only has to manage your board a little bit, and then it will just kill you with aggressive negotiations, or like stick a Bo-Katan and then you'll just be like out of the game forever. It doesn't matter if you have 25 damage on their base. If the Bo-Katan prunes your board, you can only hit them for 4 in the next turn, and then they just run, Bo-Katan with 1,000,000 XP on it and Hammerhead with aggressive negotiations on it at your face, and you die. So I want to dive into why these newer board control decks are a little bit different than the old SWU types of things. And then as far as new SWU goes, like, because they have to compete in this environment where like most of the decks that are good right now are this kind of like I'm gonna do nothing, like taller mid-range inevitability type strategies, the Cad Bane, Mandalorian, and Krennics. Because these like new SWU decks have to compete in that environment, a lot of the times you're like trying to limp towards the finish line. And so, rather than the other aggressive strategies in the past, which had like really dominant swing plays, like, Sabine always had ECL Poe or something broken like that. These decks have to make do with like far more limited tools to output aggression, which was fine in a lawless time when the card quality was so much lower, but now has like additional burdens. And you're kind of like trying to derive more benefit from your metagame position. This like kind of kill you on 7 with aggressive negotiation strategy is much harder now because your opponents' ability to interact with your board has improved so much. So these decks I feel are no longer like driving the format, but the card pool that everyone is operating with is still like trying to push them towards it. It's very, very interesting how this is all shaking out. So I want to talk a little bit more about like why I think this is the case, or kind of like present additional arguments to try to support this theory. Okay, so let's talk about the individual decks in their like as like as far as I understand them, and like what they're attempting to do, or like what their thesis on this like environment is. Okay, so the do nothing decks. These are exemplified by Krennic and Mandalorian, and they're a product of like Cad Bane Blue's existence, right? As like a deck that is pretty good at trying to play this like old SWU idea and just eliminating all of your units. The like play a 2-drop on 3, play a 3-drop on 3, play a 4-drop on 4, and try to hit their base with it strategy is like, maybe that was, you think of like a Jin Red or like a Vel Red, these strategies that people were trying at the beginning of A Lawless Time, they just like get eaten alive by by Cad Bane. Like you just can't make any progress. And so these do nothing decks, these like other taller strategies have emerged in response to that, where you say like, okay, if you're going to try to eat all of my units, like what if I eat my units first? Like in Cad Bane's case, in Krennic's case, I'm just going to turn my units into credits because like they're going to die anyway. And like the 2, 3, and like even the 4 cost units often are like pretty crummy. I guess the 4 costs in Blue Villain are pretty good, but the 2 and 3 cost units are still like pretty whatever in terms of like their ultimate impact on the game. So Krennic just says, okay, you want to kill my units, I'll do you one better, I'll kill them myself, I'll get some sort of advantage for it, and then, what if I only play good cards? Like I'll just play a higher quality card down the line with, by giving up my early game, which, wouldn't matter anyway because your deck is built to kind of like full clear mine every turn. Mandalorian is a similar concept. It doesn't even play a card onto like almost ever. I think it's almost categorically worse to play a card on the 2 resource turn, the first turn of the game, than just to claim initiative, draw a card. You can say like, okay, I spent my first turn putting 5 more HP on my base. That was cool. But anyway, pretty similar in the sense that the relevant units that it ends up playing are very good into Cad Bane because it's the stuff that comes online later. Like you want to hammerhead them to kill their leader and establish a 5/7 in space. That's pretty good. You want to play Anakin, double shrink their board. You want to play stuff like Bo-Katan. All of the little stuff is really, really incidental. Like against Cad Bane, you hardly ever play your units that cost 2 through 4 because like they're just gonna die. You don't have enough like activity to defend them. Those are cards that exist mostly for either later in the game, like you want to establish a Harrison Dula just because she puts so much pressure on your opponent to address your 3-cost unit that they have to do something. Like they will have to like no glory her because if she readies and hits their base with aggressive negotiations, they can't win the game anymore. Like you swung like you did 14 damage to their base, you healed 14. That's ridiculous. It's crazy. It's crazy. But like the low cost units in this Mandalorian deck are often just like matchup cards. Like the Hera on 3 against Cad Bane is useless, it'll die. The Hona on 4 against Cad Bane is useless, it'll die. But like against the space decks that are just trying to ignore you, or like something like the Ezra, I guess that's a space deck that is trying to ignore you. Like those cards are broken against that deck. So the Mandalorian has like the very unique privilege to just like not have to engage with your opponent really, just because you're gonna draw a million cards. You're always gonna have the ability to play the game later, and it takes your deck once you get to that point very little to convert the game. You just need like 2 ready units and that's it, which is very, very unique, and it's a product of aggressive negotiations still being a legal cardboard, right? So anyway, that's a deck that is a do nothing deck in the sense that like I don't want to just like push into my opponent's board removal. What if I only played good cards like Hammerhead? I mean, that card's ridiculous. It's Rival's Fall that comes with a 5/7 spaceship. That's the thesis for a lot of these like do nothing decks that people are trying to do. So all they do is they just kind of vibe out. They don't really do anything. They don't engage with your opponent's board, and then you just play a better unit than them. Like a really key reason that this is the case is like your opponent's ability. They only get to play the game for like 2 or 3 turns before you start doing crazy things. Like in Krennic's case, you can dump out a pre-VIZLA as early as 4, which in my opinion is typically not very good because you can't play resupply carrier on the next turn. If you did the Enoch meme, like you put a million damage on your base, and ultimately you're up like pre-VIZLA and a token to their Costco and a token. Like it's not very good. Anyway, but like the reason you can even consider this strategy of like I'm just not gonna play the game on 2, and I'm not even gonna play the game on 3 a lot of the time either, is because like what is your opponent going to do in the next couple of turns? Like their 2 costs will hit you for 2, like okay, cool. Their 3 costs will hit you for some amount, like okay, cool. You'll have 5 damage on your, like that's not the end of the world. And like even then, on these like 4, 5, 6 like mid game turns, typically what was happening in pre-rotation is that all the good leaders costed 5, right? And many of them even played ramp. So you could not afford to just hard sack your early game to quite that degree unless you were like also a ramp deck, because like your opponent was going to be doing something quite broken on 4 and like almost assuredly on 5 as well. Like in this current world that we live in, where the card activity is so lower and all the leaders cost more, like your ability to develop momentum in the early game is really, really like not quite what it was. So these strategies are like pretty well positioned. The burden to punish these is quite difficult for a lot of decks, and it's like a major consideration of this format of like, if you're going to opt to be aggressive, like really what can you do that is better than just ramping, making 2 credits, or just drawing 2 cards and playing something like mediocre on 3 for Mando. Your burden to do something good in the first 3 turns of the game is like actually kind of hard to fulfill. So that's like a pretty interesting development. Okay, what is the weakness of this deck? Well, they are still beholden to the new SWU card pool, which is like quite lacking compared to what it was. All of these strategies like don't have good ramp, right? So they can't access their kind of big inevitability cards earlier. Krennic is the only one that gets away with playing ramp pretty much at the moment, and just like as a result of his ability to play the bounty hunter guy on 3 frequently and do a super laser technician impression, right? That's like one of his advantages. Resupply carrier, same thing, like pretty good in his deck, but like outside of that, these cards are not very good and not commonly played. Okay, so a lot of these like strategies would love more ramp. They don't really have access to it, but they're also like missing the broken like cheap removal, right? Like Power of the Dark Side was such a crazy card, and like especially something like a Barrage, which like would always trade up, or like 2 for 1 your opponent, just like knock them off the board completely. These cards are not accounted for anymore, and really like hinder these decks' ability to like ultimately scale. So interesting that these decks are like both well situated because the card pool is less active, which lets them like get away with not playing the game for a little bit longer, and additionally like leaders come out later. But even like once they are doing this, their eventual like power is much weak. Like if Overwhelming Barrage existed and you flip your like you go double ramp Krennic Barrage, like you just can never lose, like ever, 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 ever. But you don't have those types of cards anymore to like encourage that gameplay. So it's pretty interesting. It's a question of like where you fall in your evaluation of like, is this worth doing? Like, yes, I can get away with it, but like even when I get away with it, like, okay, what am I doing after that? Like I said, like just so many games where this Krennic deck, for example, like ramps out a pre-VIZLA, and you look up and you're like, well, I still like, I'm not doing anything. Like I don't have anything to convert this into, and my opponent's just like going to continue to run whatever strategy their deck is doing. So anyway, that's the, I think, situation of these like do nothing decks, these taller mid-range ideas. And I think it's a pretty interesting adaptation because you didn't have even the ability to consider doing this in a lot of this time meta, just because the card pool was even more bereft than it was. Krennic didn't have pre-VIZLA to even like consider making his deck around, something like that. And the Mandalorian just didn't exist. Deidre was not quite this guy, although the Deidre leader was a closer, impression to this than what did exist impersonating Krennic in a lot of this time. Okay, let's talk about like why this metagame is existing. It's because of Cad Bane Blue. This is what everyone is trying to build their deck around, build their deck to beat. This is like kind of the level 1 play going into Galactics very clearly. And it is still like a good way, it's the most old SWU way of playing the game. It is the most like human being, like this is what makes a good SWU deck type of deck. And the reason for this is just like your board presence in Star Wars Unlimited is so important. The primary way that cards die is by unit combat, and of course, like it is relatively hard to deploy a card actively to board, especially now that like ambushers are less frequent and like units with strong on-play effects are less frequent. Like quite a bit needs to happen before you actually get to make use out of your cards. Very, 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 very few things have haste. So like all these things in conjunction make your board your most precious resource. That I like slurred my words there. I'm sorry. It makes your board your most precious resource in Star Wars Unlimited. You could have 0 cards in your hand. It doesn't matter if your board looks broken. So that's why like the board removal decks have tended to be pretty good in this game. So that's what Cad Bane's trying to do. The only issue with this is that it is trying to do this with a card pool that does not want this to be done, right? It is not old SWU. It is not, this environment where Hantu Blue comes around and it's like just deploying all these incredible board control to like it's playing Grogu as its 2-cost unit, fully loaded with damage. Like it cannot be expressed how broken Grogu was as a board control tool. Like that card was ridiculous. Cad Bane does not have Grogu. He has blank 2/4s just like everyone else, right? And like his leader ability is good. It's half a Grogu. That's pretty good. But like his kit, his ability to play units in his deck that do things is like not quite what old SWU was. So you're trying to play the game with these clunky like kind of like new SWU tools. Like you have Tie Dagger. Like that's what qualifies as a good like control tool for your deck now. You don't have, I keep saying that this deck is like very much not Hantu Blue. That doesn't mean it's bad. That does not mean it's bad. It's doing something that very few decks in the format can do, which is have control over your opponent's board, establish like, up one guy, up two guys, up three guys. Like these are all good traits. But I just need to point out, like, the game is not quite what it was. Your tools to do this are not quite what they were. Hantu Blue was controlling the board with like crazy broken units. Grogu's nuts. Itinerant Warrior was crazy at the time. Chirrut was crazy at the time. Lucas Skywalker is a broken card. Lucas Skywalker Dragon Knight. Like that guy's nuts, When he untaps, you win the game. You can't lose. You're healing 1,000,000 every single turn. You played him a turn early. Like all of these things were nuts. Cad Bane does not quite have that card quality. Especially in its early curve. You're not playing, Anakin on 5 in this deck. You're playing God knows what on 5. What is this deck's 5 play? It's Justifier. Like that card's pretty good, but it requires a ton of setup. Like that card's not Anakin on 5, A lot different things happening with this Cad Bane deck. But like the core purpose is like, okay, this is the best that post-rotation SWU allows for. This is by far like the best like attempt to control your board deck that exists right now. It's not even close. The only question you have is like, how good is this in this new environment with this new card pool? Like, is this Cad Bane Blue deck good enough? Again, like maybe it's just like me attempting to put like too high expectation of this deck to have found like the Hantu Blue like broken board control deck of the format, but like far more questions, as I keep saying, for me than I would like. This deck is absolutely not bad. It's playing the game in a good way, and it's like getting there, and it's very consistent in doing so. And every card in this deck is furthering this game. But like, these are all great traits. But like the core question is not like, is clicking Cad Bane every single turn good? The core question is like, is this the right way to be playing the game? Is this what the format is asking for? And why is it that I am like sweating my ass off every single game, wondering if I'm going to be able to kill the next thing my opponent plays? Like, if this deck is good, why do I feel like the margins are so low? So that's my thesis on Cad Bane Blue. Again, just need to continue to emphasize when this deck inevitably like wins worlds or something. I'm not trying to sandbag this deck. I'm not saying it's ass. I'm just saying that like the ecosystem it finds itself in and the tools available to it are, I think, a lot more limited than you would expect just being someone that's played Star Wars Unlimited for a long time. You just go, these are the decks that I typically like. These are the decks that are typically good. Put it in my brain and register the deck list. Not quite the case. Again, very different game. Ashes of Empire, very different format. It's not Lawless Time. It's not Spark the Republic. It's different format. It's always a different format. The card pool is always different, so we have to understand the game differently. And I just have to remark, Pre-VIZLA is broken. I mean, this card's bonkers. So if there's anything in this deck that's broken, it's Pre-VIZLA. Let's never cap. That card is busted. We can all move on. We all know this. Okay, the new SWU decks, I mean, not a whole lot interesting to say here. A lot of these decks are just hitting base. They are interesting because this is like how the game is meant to be played right now. I don't know. It's what the card pool is trying to have you do. Like the card activity in like post rotation, like even in Ashes, like pretty important. Like your 4 and 5 cost cards are still like rather like subpar. It's interesting. One of the best 4 cost, like most active cards that was printed in Ashes. There are 2 of them, in fact. It's the gosh, what is this card's name? The 4/5 like ATST Ambusher. It's in green villain. It's a 4/5 ambusher if you have a non-unique. That card's like crazy rate. That card is really really good, but it doesn't see play because like the non-unique cards aren't good and constructed typically. So that's number one. And like the second one's Keller and Beck. Like this card's rather good. In Grief, it's just like a 4/5 as well. But these cards just like don't quite have homes. So we're still in this metagame where like your 4 and 5 cost plays are still like pretty inactive. It's not quite the board apocalypse that you might suggest when you said like, oh, they printed a 4/5 ambusher and like another 4/5 ambusher in both hero and villain. Like surely these cards see play, but like not quite the case. So we're still very much in a metagame where you're incentivized to hit base for everything that is not exactly like blue villain. That was like the only color that continued to get cards that like contravene that. And Casca and Imperial Armored Commando are so strong that they're like single-handedly like warping the format around them. If those two cards didn't exist, we would very much, I think, still be in like the old SWU world. I guess Marok as well, just like giving Cad Bane even like a million Sentinels to play on 3. So if it were not for like just the general strength of blue and blue villain especially, I think these new SWU type of decks where you're just like putting a curve of guys in your deck and closing your eyes and hitting their base, I think they would be like far more dominantly positioned. But it is interesting, and this is something that I always like to kind of like argue, is that it is kind of interesting that the format is warped around these certain cards because it gives you more of a basis. If the blue villain cards weren't so strong, this other like style of play would just kind of like crowd out everything else, and then we'd have a far less interesting format. So the availability of strong cards that are limited to a specific archetype of card, it just gives you the ability to have like multiple competing hypotheses within a format, which is very much what you're seeing here. So I talked a little bit about like these two camps of decks. You got the like let's just pull up the like you have this like tall mid-range like I'm gonna do nothing strategy that's trying to play like old SWU with a new SWU card pool, and then you have this like I hope I can get there like limp across the finish line aggro strategies that are trying to play new SWU with the new SWU card pool, but like they're missing the most broken cards with our Imperial Armored Commando, pre-VIZLA, Chimera. I mean, have you ever tried playing these like I hope I get across the finish line decks when your opponent curves Chimera into pre-VIZLA? It's impossible. You lose the game like every single time. It's ridiculous. So interesting metagame we find ourselves in. Lots of like competing ideas of like what's good and like where you should ultimately end up. But that's what makes the format, and that's what makes it interesting and difficult to figure out what the heck I'm supposed to play, what deck you're choosing. That's like the underpinnings of a lot of these metagame considerations. It's the card pool, it's the shared card pool. Everyone has access to the same card pool. You could register the Galactic Championship winning deck like right now. Like that deck exists for you to grasp, right? It's just on us to find that answer. It's the interesting part of the format. Okay, what the heck was I talking about? Okay, reasons for the situation. I don't want to spend too much time on this because like I don't have any particular like insight into these things. I don't have a game dev background. I don't talk to the dev, so it's just me like giving out my random opinions on things. But even so, like I think it behooves us to at least have like a theory for why we're in this situation now. First of all, like leader design changes is really really important. Really really like fundamental to how the game works. Like it's a leader-based game, of course your leader matters, but something that's like pretty important is that the leaders were like designed in chunks more or less. Like when you were making Spark of the Republic, like I keep saying this, Spark of the Rebellion, whatever that set was called. When you're making the first 3 sets, like you're not thinking about well, what the heck's the meta going to look like 2 years from now at Galactic Championship 2026. Like I'm sure like you are planning it out, like you are you have some sort of idea for where you want the game to go. But like at the end of Twilight, like that's when the recalibrations article hit, and then there's like been a change in leader design ever since then. If you think about pre-rotation, like all of the good leaders, most of them were printed either in set 1 or set 2. That's where a lot of the broken fellows are printed. We got Django, he was pretty good. JTL pilots were junk. They were junk. They sucked until everything rotated and everything else was bad. Then those cards were busted. Now LOF, like those leaders were also pretty bad. Like Talzin was Iwan Worlds, unfortunately. Kylo Ren was pretty broken. So that was good. But the rest of the leaders in that set, they weren't no Han Solo. There weren't no FETT. in that set, right? So you have these sets that were designed kind of like not all at the same time, and you see like a progression of leader design since the beginning of the game to like kind of where we are now. But they were like made in chunks, right? The JTL, LOF, and Secrets leaders had to exist alongside like all the broken fellas that they printed in set one, and like just have to pray that like I can't even like who was good from Secrets that even like the plot palp like existed. He wasn't very good. People tried to play Save. That leader was terrible. Like I don't even know who from Secrets you could qualify as relevant. Like Deidre was a deck that existed pre like maybe I don't know. Okay, let's not talk about that too much. So all this to say, leader design changes. I want to talk about these in particular because this is the far more tangible ones. And then as for like where we are in Ashes, like I keep talking about how like the card pool clunkiness or like I guess like the comparisons of this card pool to the card pool that we had in the past and that we currently have in Eternal, right? Two kind of important things from this is number one, just like the way that archetype support is rolled out in this game. You don't have like named archetype support very frequently or at all. Like this was something that was attempted a little bit at the beginning of this game's life cycle with like the Fett's Fire Spray, for example, which was supposed to be like named Boba Fett support, Boba Fett's Armor, which was named Boba Fett support. Turns out when you have named support for a good leader, the deck ends up being pretty high quality. We don't do that anymore. We have, you know, within set like theming support, and then like after the set ships, you know, we don't continue to like have named like Rey Skywalker support really. Like they say that they're printing cards for the LOF Rey Skywalker, but like really you would have to do something so particular and like specific to make that leader good, and they don't quite do that. Like other games, you can have like a buns leader, but if you just print like a suite of broken like main deck support guide, I've seen how many times where, you know, this like terrible archetype just ends up being completely revitalized with like outcoming support, and that's what like defines the deck going forward. But that's not how Star Wars Unlimited card design works. And the like final upshot of this is that like because there's not specific support, most decks in Star Wars Unlimited end up being these like good stuff, like you can call them like slop piles of sorts, which is like fine. It's using like your card pool identity to determine your deck, and then you just kind of like pick the best leader for your card pool and like that go, you know. But like the downside of that is decks tend to like lack the ability to do something like meaningfully different from one another within their card pool, and so I want to talk about that just a little bit. Take this like example for like the force mechanic in LOF, right? Chirrut was printed what by now 3-4 sets ago, 1, 2, 3, 4 sets ago, yeah. This guy used to pass for like the most broken like 4-cost sentinel you could play. Fast forward now, Chirrut Imwe now has to compete with Koska Reeves and Imperial Armored Commando, which are like very comparable, if not just like straight better cards in many situations. But the only difference is that Chirrut requires you to build your entire deck around him, put 2 damage in your base before the deck, you know, the game starts, and like include a different like other suite of cards to also synergize with this mechanic. Because like you don't probably like he's not good enough just to play on his own for the force mechanic. It's just not the case, you know. So pretty interesting in that this card that was printed all this time ago in an Ashes of Empire format now has to compete with like all of the most like latest and greatest types of tools, which ends up like dragging down his entire mechanic with him, because like, you know, these things that require the force token are having to compete in this new environment with cards that, okay, well, I don't have to jump through a hoop. My card always has text, you know. Kind of like important design there. And then finally, like I don't want to harp on this point too much, but I do think that the color like quality across the board is not quite uniform. A lot of colors are still very much missing top end. I've said how many times today, like blue villain, blue villain, blue villain. It's very much the case that that is the only color that has like really, really powerful top end, like ubiquitously powerful top end. Green villain does not. Ravager is not pre-VIZLA. Trask Walker is not even Reinforcement Walker, you know. So a lot of decks do not currently have top end, and I think this is pretty much exemplified most with yellow. Yellow is a pretty bad secondary color right now, and it's keeping entire archetypes of decks from being able to compete. If you think even in the Lawless Time format, even though Lando Calrissian Lake Country like was mono yellow, which would lead you to believe that yellow was a pretty good color, it really wasn't. It was really like Lando had that color on his back, and it just so happened that the rest of the package like played well with what he was doing. If you think about all the other decks in the format, which ones were secondary color yellow? It was Darth Vader, which had a negative win rate, and it was Talzin Yellow, which also had a negative win rate. And like, what was yellow providing to each of those archetypes? Like in Talzin, it was providing the Stranger almost exactly, and Hold for Questioning, which like had nothing to do with the Talzin game plan really. Like, so anyway, the card colors like not being consistent is I think another reason that we're in this like world where you have like the blue villain, like kind of bigger mid-range type decks, and then like the everything else category of like kind of good stuff pile beat down slop decks, if you would. So I think that's what's defining the Ashes of Empire format right now. Okay, leader design changes. I want to give a little bit more thoughts about this because this is the actual like important and like tangible one. Old SWU, very much the case that like all the good leaders costed 5. Absolutely the case. This is really important because the swing turns that you took around SWU were almost always like around your leader. It was the turn that like the most action was happening. It was where the game was often decided. And when you got your leader first, obviously this is good. When your opponent got their leader first, obviously this is bad, you know, because they're going to break your board. They're going to, you know, have units left over, which means that when you have to deploy, for example, your 6-cost leader, you're deploying them into a losing board state, which means like just so many things bad happen to you. The only exceptions to this were, I swear there were only 2 good 6-cost leaders for the entirety of Old SWU. It was, you know, Rey, she was good. She was fine. She was, I think, mostly carried by her colors, and like in metas where Yoda like was not called for, she was like the like other blue, like the most other playable blue hero guy to exist alongside Data Vault, you know? Like her day-to-day ability was by far the more impactful thing. Her flip was like just kind of there. It was fine. Anyway, she was fine. Cad Bane was good, and he didn't have the problem that the other, you know, 6 flips leaders did, because he was scamming you, and he was up a guy frequently, you know, even going into his flip turn. So that was a leader that did not have the other 6-cost leader problems. And then outside of them, like almost every other 6-cost leader was just like not good, like almost like uncompetitive. Like Anakin was the only one that you can make an argument for being so, but like I would argue that that leader was just like never good. You know, there was never a format where he ended up being like the best possible deck. He was just like usually playable, which, you know, as far as the 6-cost leader goes, is like more than most. And then Han Solo, Spark Republic, you know, that was a 5-cost leader. Like, let's not delude ourselves. It says 6, that was a 5-cost leader. We all know this. Okay, that was that. So you take your big swing turn around your leader, and like most often it was even something as simple as like the Han 2 like 3/6 body is just, you had a free body to work with, which meant that you got to clear your opponent's board. So when you had a free body, they didn't. Obviously this is good. Okay, so this is very much changed with the new SWU environment, like very obviously and intentionally. All of the new leaders have been bumped up in the curve from 5 to 6, and just like lacking access to the free leader that you get every single game makes a huge difference on like the stickiness of your units, your ability to like utilize them to accomplish anything, you know, your 4 and 5 costs, right? You have one less turn of hitting your opponent's board with your free vanilla, if you will. One less turn of utilizing their on-attack ability, which frequently is just whatever they did on their leader side anyway, which isn't too exciting, but like nonetheless, one turn slower. And I think the effects of the new leader design go like even further than this. So obviously the cost being additional is the most important change, right? We kind of forget by now, and someone just like pointed out this to me recently, and it's like boggles the mind to think about. We used to play Boba Fett, the banned one, on 4 resources because of the existence of good ramp on 3, right? And like then this boy would play Overwhelming Barrage and then put Boba Fett's armor on his guy. Like it boggles the mind like what was occurring in Old SWU compared to what we're doing now, which is just like both sides play a 4 cost and we go about our day. The world is still peaceful, and then because neither of us flip our leader on 5, like on 5 we do the same thing of like we both play a real unit and then go about our day and like nothing terrible happens to anybody. Like it's crazy. Um, so yeah, new SWU still in ashes, very much like defined by the leader design, the higher cost of the leaders. Something additional that makes the leaders less swingy and less like, in my opinion, powerful. There are just fewer synergy tools for leaders to make use of, right? If you think of like what a ping meant in pre-rotation, because just Tarkin Town was not ejected from the format like the freaking scourge it was, like it's totally different. Like your Cad Bane ping now, like it doesn't mean quite as much. Like I guess you would have to play double red, which you probably wouldn't happen to do. But like if you think of like old Cad Bane, the yellow one, and what a ping meant in that deck, it was just broken. Like you just couldn't play the game, just because T-Town exists. And the same with Sabine, right? Just energy conversion lab existing meant that like aggressive decks could always just build your own active unit. Like a Poe Dameron without ECL is like not quite what it was. And like the Sabine deck in general without energy conversion lab, like that was a bum deck. Like the Sabine Data Vault deck is like one of the worst card game decks I've seen. Like it boggles the mind that this deck accomplished anything or like convinced people to play it. Like it makes me vibrate, like crazy business. But like just the lack of the ability to give your cards additional value, just by other cards existing in the game. Because like again, like we're in this world where your three cost is a three cost and your four cost is a four, and they're just like balls of stats with marginally differences between them. And like sometimes your four cost is Koska Reeves, and sometimes your four cost is Ezra Bridger, and like these cards are not the same. Really they're not. But anyway, the lack of your ability to like just build your own good cards with other synergy tools is really noticeable at the moment, and like changes the ways that deck plays, and of course is leading to this like new SWU environment that we currently enjoy. Even finally, just like your ability to find synergistic powerful events and like utility cards in your deck is again like not quite the way it was. Like think of the Lando Calrissian deck. This is like a credit deck. All of the credit event synergies are garbage. Like you don't want to play unmarked credits. You don't want to play backed by the huts. Like these are garbage cards. They're not very good. They're built for draft, in which like they're pretty cool in draft, I guess. I don't know. But like as far as like constructed goes, like is not the case where like just think about how leaders are. Like Lando Calrissian does not interact with any of his credit supports because they're all junk. Bosk was like built to interact with bounties, and just think about like what that deck turned bounties into. Like Lando Calrissian turns credits into broken. He interacts with Bix. Bix was like really important for that deck, so it wasn't all junk. It wasn't all junk. So your cards are still interacting with the mechanics that they're supposed to support, but like it's not quite to the same degree. I feel. So you think of like I'm gonna use like all the different Palpatines, right? To try to like explain this, right? Plot Palpatine, he interacts with plot in what way? You're incentivized to put plot in your deck because your ability says I get to draw cards. Okay, that's cool. I don't really understand what that has to do with the plot mechanic. I guess because if you draw more plot, you can then deploy more of your fun cards on your flip turn because your leader like ramps them out. Like I guess that makes sense, right? But like the advantage palp, like what does the advantage palp have to do with the other advantage cards? Like again, like maybe this is like plays better in the starter deck context. Like maybe you would see the cards that say like destroy an advantage, draw two, like more powerful in that context. But as far as constructed goes, like these decks do not engage with the card pool in very like meaningful ways. There's like nothing is interacting with the card pool to quite the level of ECL Poe or yellow Cad Bane and Tarkin Town. But like maybe that's for the best, because like how happy were you every time you got Cad Bane Tarkin Town, and how happy were you every time you got ECL Poe? I don't know. It's or like think of like Han and DJ, like Tech DJ. Like okay, that was interacting with the rest of the card pool. That was synergistic. Was that good? I'll let you be the judge. I liked doing it. I'm sure my opponent had a great time whenever they lost the game on the spot on 4 resources, So the good and the bad. Again, it's just like a different environment. It's like what the card pool is calling for right now. So wanted to give just a overview of that. To kind of bring it back home, what is the point of all this discussion? I kind of like had a little bit of a non sequitur into like the more Cardpool in theory side of things. But let's bring it all back to like what is important for winning a tournament. What is important for like success at GC, right? Okay, set 7 to set 8. Racing was very important in set 7. Base HP was very, very important in set 7. I think that this is a little bit less so in set 8, just because there are more viable decks that have tools to control your opponent's ability to do damage. This is, again, basically just because blue is so dang strong right now. Koskaru is broken. Imperial Armor Commando is also like rather broken. So a lot of the decks that are good right now are just making use of those cards, and it improves their ability to address this previous format that was existing, and they're now imposing new conditions on the format. Okay. Most decks presenting lethal on very specific turns. Building your game plan to say, I'm going to get across the finish line here through this means with this card. It's always aggressive negotiations. This is not quite the case anymore. Basically for the same reasons of blue villain exists and has good top end, and these are decks that can just like play pre-VIZLA Ninth Sister Chimera for 3 or 4 turns, weave in a no glory Koska turn in the middle game when you start to put out your big thing, these are the decks that are like currently like most popular and most, lording over the format. And this is very much throwing a wrench in your ability to plan out specific lethal turns. Like the Mandalorian deck, as opposed to DeJamiro, because its units are always getting removed by, Cad Bane ping plus pre-VIZLA, no longer really knows when it's going to win. It just says, I'll win eventually through this means, as opposed to the control deck that used to exist, which was DeJamiro, which says, I'm going to untap a Devastator, PB you, touch you with Devastator, you will die. And you did. So anyway, very much like kind of reminiscent of old SWU, and this stress to like once again like counting the number of bombs in your deck is important. Knowing how many of these cards you're going to see over the course of the game and impacts your resourcing decisions. These decisions like once again are important, whereas before in old new SWU, I guess you could say, in set 7 it wasn't quite as important, because you could say, well, I only need 1 Liberty and 1 Qui-Gon, and that should get me there, because I know one of us is dying by this time, because we can't really do anything to stop it. Pretty important like change of the format, where we're kind of hovering back to the old SWU way of like the game can end anywhere from 7 to 12. The Cad Bane blue deck and anything like blue villain is very, very much capable of playing the long game, and is even like rather comfortable doing so. Okay, tall inevitability decks were almost completely missing from the previous format. Obviously, like with everything I've said, as I keep talking about blue villain in general and how they're defining the format currently, these decks are back. Pretty much every good deck in the top 5 outside of space and like kind of blue-green hero is this like taller mid-range inevitability type of idea. And like that is very different than the aggressive negotiations world that we lived in previously. And like, everyone complained about that one. You should be having now, right? I don't know. It's just a different format. I don't try to think about things in what like I want to see from a format. It's just like, okay, what are we being asked right now? I think right now it's just trying to say, how much do we think that the Chimera VIZLA curve just like owns everyone? I think is very much the question that the GC format is asking. I keep expressing my reservations with this Cad Bane deck, and I think that speaks to the difficulty I'm having answering this question. Whereas, it's very clearly what's imposing rules on the format, but like something about whenever I play that deck just like doesn't have me completely buying it. So I'm still continuing to investigate these like alternative solutions, these decks that are still trying to play new SWU and all of those sorts of things. But like I will be more than happy falling in the kind of like blue villain, tall mid-range inevitability slop type of idea if we can't find anything better. It's just kind of like where you end up when you're challenging a format. Okay, so interesting about this format, just to bring it all into a bow, 2 different styles of playing the game. One is like trying to play the game in the old fashion with new cards. One is trying to play the, style in the new fashion with the new cards, but like not the good ones. So you have this like conflict of ideals. And then within each like style of gameplay, you have like rock, paper, scissors type matchups. The Cad Bane deck beats the Krennic deck up pretty badly, but struggles into the Mandalorian deck a little bit. And Krennic, I think, also struggles in the Mandalorian a little bit. But like, these are things that you have to ask yourself within the format. It's like, okay, number one, which side of the fence do I sit on? Do I want to be the reactive deck in the style of old SWU, or do I want to like continue this like new SWU idea of like, try to kill you by a certain turn and be the aggressor? And that is what, I think is being called for in this format. Or, are you going against that, saying that like, nope, the blue villain cards are going to drag us right back to where we were. These cards give you too much control over the game, and I feel like this is the more comfortable philosophy to espouse. I think that's what's going on right now. In terms of your barometer for where we are in the format, this is what I think is really interesting. This Hona card was, like, in my opinion, definitive of what made set 7 different than before. Because if you played this Hona card pre-rotation, you would be laughed out of the room. And do you know how I know this happened? People tried to play this Hona card. Just for some reason, it was a Force Jedi Rebel Spectre named Kanan Jarrus, and this card was horrible. Whenever you played this card, something crap happened to you. God forbid your opponent had ramped previously, and you just like play out this dude like meekly, and then they just like close their eyes and do everything horrible to your board, and you have nothing by the end of it. But like in post rotation SWU, Hona was like very quickly one of the best cards in the racing metagame that was established. And I thought that was really fascinating because like I just remember when we saw like the first results from that like European invitational that had, it was only like 30 people, but like all of these red blue decks were playing Hona, and I was like, I'm gonna cut that card. Like that card's junk. Like this card does not conform to my idea of a good Star Wars Unlimited card. But like when you played it, you're like, oh no, like this card is broken currently. Because I mean, dude, this thing hits for so much. It restores 1,000,000 HP. Like this card is essentially all the good parts of Luke Skywalker as for what you need for the format. So like in evaluating where we are in this metagame, I think to myself, the piggy stands alone. Where does this stand as a measure stick for this format? And like to a lesser degree, like aggressive negotiations, a pretty similar type of card, like gives you control over the race. Luckily, or maybe not luckily, Hona sucks again. This card is like once again like junk. Maybe like that's an exaggeration, but compared to what it's competing against at its resource level, like this card no longer quite cuts it, So that's interesting. That makes me think that we are, not quite where we were in a lawless. Like it shows me like where we've shifted since a lawless time, where like Hona was good, back to being junk, like back to resembling Kanan Jarrus of like I played this thing out and then my opponent, they played out a card that did more than it. Imperial Armored Commando like just stops this thing in its tracks. Even like beyond that, Cad Bane has the ability to just ding this thing up and get rid of it, and like not. It doesn't really matter if your Hona connects. It's not going to contribute in quite the way that the other cards possibly could. Even something like if you go Hona and they go Casca, pinning the Hona, pinging it, like, okay, all of a sudden their Casca, number one, threatens to like free trade your Hona. So you have to hit Hona into Casca and lose it, and they have the Mandalorian token left over. So like, again, this card, for a number of reasons, for its lack of activity, for the greater emphasis on board control at the moment, is no longer like quite cutting it as the house that it was, or at least purported to be at the beginning of a lawless time. So pretty interesting on that, like where that tells me where we are on the format. On the other hand, aggressive negotiations is still broken. This card's still nuts. This card should probably just like still be played in more decks. I put it even in something like a FETT, just because like I need to end the game, and my cards, the top end is still like worse than just pumping this to your opponent's base and saying like I don't want to play the game for another turn. Of course, like a big thing with aggressive negotiations is its unique home in the Mandalorian, which like makes full stupid use out of this card to like not have to play the game for a couple of turns. So just like interesting where the hallmarks of the format previously are coming to us now. Hona bad, aggressive negotiation is still good. I think that tells you something about what's currently being asked for, or at least like the controversy going on, or the difficulty in deciding where you want to fall on it, because one racing card in aggressive negotiations is good and the other one in Hona is bad. Okay, so that's the discussion for today. Kind of like a lot to talk about. I just want to again kind of like bring it home once again. The whole reason we talked about everything today is because on Eclipse CCG I tried to like always emphasize the importance in chunking decks. That was what the entire metagame report this last week was about, of how red blue villain, blue green villain, blue green hero, red yellow hero, like these are the these are like the ways that you conceptualize decks, not just like Cad Bane, not just like Ezra. Chunking decks is really important in this game because the meta appears to be so wide, where realistically the differences between all of the different blue-green villain decks are important in their specific matchups, but as for like their whole overall metagame positioning, it's more important to understand what the giant chunks are doing first and then try to break out what is occurring within the chunks, right? So this is just yet another example of this where you have the, board control decks versus the try to kill you on a certain resource level types of decks. Obviously, these decks always exist in SWU, but the purpose of this whole discussion is to show that these are decks that are attempting to operate in a world that is different than the world that existed in the past. So the aggressive decks are operating in a world that is very much encouraged by things like the higher costed leaders and the junkier events. There's no more Power of the Dark Side, for example. There's no more ECL that just like gives you card activity to always stop aggression in its track and stonewall them out of the game. We're operating in a different field. I want to try to like explain where the different major chunks are to then start helping you to understand where the interplay occurs within those chunks. So when we think about like what are the differences between all of the different board control decks and then what are the differences between all the different aggressive decks, like how come Cad Bane has such a good matchup generally into blue-green villain? Well, it's because his deck is more efficient. He chews through your board better than you chew through his. Ramping out pre-VIZLA doesn't really win you the game against him, and if everything goes wrong, he has SRI in your deck and you probably don't because you don't want to pay 2 more for that card, even though I think you probably should. That's the purpose of this talk today. Different approaches. The proof is in the pudding. Whatever ends up being the best solution to this metagame, given everything we've discussed today, where all of these questions like are answered and where those answers lie, that will all come out at the Galactic Championship. And as the format matures, as our understanding of the format matures, that's the beautiful thing about metagame, that's the beautiful thing about card games, is that everyone comes to their own conclusions and everyone's preparation is tested over the course of, thousands and thousands and thousands of games. That's what we're trying to come to today. We're trying to advance this conversation and advance our understanding of the format so that we can preemptively come to these conclusions before other people do, right? And then finally, for the Galactic Championship, every deck building decision we make presents an argument. If I choose to bring Mandalorian versus Boba Fett Lake Country, right? I am making some sort of like grander claim about what I believe to be the best strategy to reduce my opponent's base health to 0 to be, right? I'm saying something like, I want to do nothing. I don't think you can like actually put pressure on me like that. I think that it's far more important to have, these cards by this turn. These are the things that actually determine what makes a good strategy outside of the like brass tacks things I discuss on a weekly basis on Eclipse TCG, which is, well, you can't play this deck, it has a bad matchup into that deck, or you can't play this deck, it has a bad. There's something kind of like more interesting going on with what the game wants you to do, for lack of a better word, and that's what we're trying to define. And in all of our deck building decisions, from our leader base pair to our side deck to our what 4 costs we choose to put in our deck, I think that's ultimately what card games are about, and that's what I wanted to try to like go over today. So in constructing our argument, that's the reason for these theory videos, is I'm trying to give a explanation or a presentation of the various arguments and like what it is that we're trying to say through our deck building choices. Okay, so that's all I have today. Thank you as always for tuning in and watching. I'm very grateful for like the position I now find myself in, just to talk about the game. It's always fun. I've come a long way since uploading the kind of whatever deck profile at just my friend's house, where he's got the phone going up and down, and I'm like trying not to get my cards sticky on the playmat. It was great. I've really enjoyed the journey and been able to do things like having this panel is obviously not what I expected when I just arbitrarily wanted to play Star Wars Unlimited. I just thought, I like Star Wars games, I like card games, like let's go do this one. I was playing Yu-Gi-Oh at the time, like. Sincerely, like whatever game in terms of like incentive to play it is, like I guess now it's improved a little bit, but it's no Star Wars. I enjoyed this game quite a bit. So anyway, I just want to say like thanks always for tuning in, and I will catch you on the next.